Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Dwayne Schultes. I'm the Managing Director of Vital Transformation, and I'd like to thank you all very, very much for attending our webinar today on the EFPIA Transparency Code, moving the industry and healthcare professional partners forward. We've had several hundred registrations. We are very grateful for all of your participation. We know how busy everyone is. Obviously, this is a very, very compelling subject. I just want to point out that since we've had several hundred registrations, it will be very, very difficult, nigh impossible, to open up the microphones for everybody. I'm sure all of us have been on conference calls where we wish we had a mute function. Well, in this one I do, and so I will be using it judiciously. Unfortunately, we will not be able to open up the microphones for everybody, sadly. However, you can ask questions very easily in this little chat function. You can see where it says ask a question here at the bottom. I will send a question to everyone. Here we go. You'll see everyone will receive a hello. So if you would like to feed back to any of us on the webinar, you can do so with that question function. If you're having a question specifically you want me to chat just with you, you can raise your hand and I will try to get at you and see you. I can see who's raising their hand. And if you're having audio issues, I imagine the majority of you are using sort of Skype settings. You use computer, you use mouse and keyboard. You can also dial into the telephones. We provided, I think, 15 international toll-free numbers today. And if you're having trouble with the audio, please feel free to dial in. It's a free service, and we have multiple international numbers as well as a general number in the UK. So that's how it will work. I'd also like to thank our supporters of Pharmadisclosure.eu. This is a multi-stakeholder platform, and we're extremely grateful for the support of these organizations. We have more people joining. ABPI is recently going to join. We're also speaking to several healthcare professional organizations and healthcare organization providers, hospitals, etc. If anybody would be interested in becoming a branded supporter, please feel free to send me an email, and it will be our pleasure to include you in the activities and also potentially introduce you into the steering committee. This is a multi-stakeholder activity, and we absolutely want everyone engaged moving forward. That really is key. So we have an exceptional group of presenters today, and I would be remiss to continue talking. I'm now going to pass to Gary Finnegan, who's a well-renowned health journalist and author. And Gary, I pass over to you. Thank you very much for participating today.
Thank you, Dwayne, and thank you, everyone. As Dwayne has explained, we have a facility for questions, so please do keep questions coming in during the presentation. We've kept some time aside in between presentations to address some of your questions. That's a really important part of what we're doing here this afternoon. But without further ado, I will hand over to the first presenter, which is Michel, the CEO of the European Cancer Organization. Michel.
Yes, good morning, everybody. I'm indeed the CEO of the European Cancer Organization. Just in a nutshell, what we are, we're a federation of other European professional organizations, all professionals being, of course, involved in oncology. We do represent about 60,000 professionals in cancer, and we organize the biggest cancer congress in Europe every 2 years. When I say biggest cancer congress, it's a little bit less than 20,000 participants. So, and Martine Piccart, who will talk also during this presentation, is the president of our organization. So the next slide, please. So we talk about the relationship in between the pharmaceutical industry and the healthcare professional, called HCPs in the vocabulary we are using. And there's a relatively constant relationship in between those two groups, and many important innovations have arisen from that type of collaboration. And you will hear from Professor Piccart some example in a few minutes. Next slide. The worry, of course, about this relationship is that it could impact the patient. Next slide. And therefore, the concept of a conflict of interest, which I will call in the next slide the COI, conflict of interest. Next slide. Next. This, of course, relationship generates a cost for the pharmaceutical industry, so a payment to sometimes to the HCPs. Next. but it doesn't mean if there is a payment each time that, that at each time there is a conflict of interest. And for that, I will pass the word to Professor Piccart, who will give some examples of that relationship.
Yes, hello everybody.
Next slide.
So, in fact, I am absolutely convinced that close interactions between the academic world and the pharmaceutical industry are very, very important for the progress of medicine. And I am going to give you perhaps two examples related to the field of oncology, where this interaction has clearly led to a positive impact on patient care. So these two examples are taken from research in breast cancer because this is my field of expertise. The next slide. So in breast cancer, we are used to prescribe drugs to women who have been diagnosed and operated from breast cancer, because we are very afraid that some cancer cells can have escaped away from the breast and are hidden perhaps in important organs such as the liver, the lungs, the bones. And we are trying to constantly improve these treatments because they are really enhancing the chance of cure for women with early breast cancer. Now, for 2/3 of women with breast cancer, we can use endocrine agents because the tumor does express hormone receptors. And some time ago, I think it was about 15 years ago, there were new endocrine agents developed by the pharmaceutical industry called aromatase inhibitors. And these drugs were felt to be better than the old endocrine agent tamoxifen, which is an anti-estrogen, which was the reference treatment at that time. So if we can just push the button, the pharmaceutical industry, of course, was interested to launch large clinical trials, making a head-to-head comparison between the old drug and the new drug. So it was a simple study, 2 arms, 5 years of the standard treatment, tamoxifen, 5 years for the new drug. And so we in the academic world entered in a lot of discussion with the pharmaceutical industry because we were thinking that there were perhaps other strategies which could also work for patients and which at the end of the day could be even perhaps better. And that was the use of a sequence of these 2 drugs, either starting with the old drug tamoxifen or starting with the new drug, the aromatase inhibitor. We can push the button. So that was our choice. And so we had a very, very long discussion with the pharmaceutical industry. At the end, they listened to us, and the clinical trial that was launched was a 4-arm clinical trial testing these 4 strategies. We can push the button at the end. What we found is that one of these 2 sequential arms, the one where we start with the new drug and then after 2-3 years move to the old drug, was as good as the new investigational arm where the new drug was given alone for 5 years. And it turned out that the sequential arm is better tolerated by a large proportion of women, because these new drugs have some side effects, and there is also a problem of compliance with a substantial proportion of women stopping the drug because they simply cannot tolerate it. So this was an example of a really very positive interaction between academia and pharma, leading to, I think, better patient care at the end. The second example, if we can push the button, is also another example taken from the field of research in breast cancer. So here we are talking about a special form of breast cancer, 1 in 5 breast cancers, where the cancer cell expresses 2 million of growth factor receptor at the surface of the cancer cell as a result of aberrant amplification of a gene. So these cancers, as you can imagine, are very aggressive, grow very rapidly. Next slide. And what is really great is that very interesting drugs targeting this specific growth factor receptor at the surface of the cancer cell have been developed. And these are intelligent drugs, 2 monoclonal antibodies, trastuzumab, pertuzumab, and another compound, lapatinib, which is a small molecule also capable of blocking the growth factor receptor. Now, the next slide shows you what is perhaps the most innovative drug designed in this area. This is an antibody-drug conjugate, so the principle is very simple. A very potent chemotherapeutic agent is linked to the antibody, trastuzumab, which can recognize the growth factor receptor at the surface of the cancer cell, which can therefore bind to the cancer cell. And what is happening here is that the antibody will introduce the chemotherapeutic agent inside the cancer cell. So the beauty of this drug is that, of course, it will attack primarily the cancer cells and it will spare normal tissue. So at the end of the day, this is a very effective drug, and at the same time, it is a drug which is exceptionally well tolerated by patients. The next slide. So the drug has been shown to be active in advanced breast cancer. And the question now is, how can we bring this very innovative drug earlier in the disease course? Can we give this drug to women who have been operated and try to prevent a recurrence of the disease in the years following surgery? And here, of course, the preference of industry is to go for a design which is very safe vis-à-vis regulatory authorities. So the design is that you continue to give to all these women standard aggressive chemotherapy combined with the 2 antibodies that are directed at the HER2 receptor, and then by chance women will have 50% probability of getting the new drug in addition to the standard treatment, or they will simply be observed. So this is an add-on strategy where we keep adding new compounds to the standard of care. And we in the academic world have been convinced that there was probably another option in selected women, and this other option was to get rid of the aggressive chemotherapy and to give to this new innovative compound a chance to replace aggressive chemotherapy in some women, which would be, of course, very beneficial in terms of quality of life and possibility to go back to work very soon. So the next slide. Next slide, please. So I am a strong believer that close collaboration between pharma and academia is absolutely essential. It is very important in designing good clinical trials, and ultimately it is these good clinical trials which are bringing more effective treatments to our patients. We can also sometimes conduct clinical trials together. There is also an interaction that is very important in trying to interpret the results of clinical trials and disseminate them. And we also have very important and fruitful discussions on what to do with the tumor samples that we collect in these clinical trials in an attempt to better understand who are the patients who are going to benefit from the new treatment and those who are not going to benefit. So the last slide I would like to show you is the one that follows, but of course you will understand that we need to build trust between these two worlds, academia and pharma. Otherwise there cannot be a good interaction, a positive interaction that will ultimately benefit patients. And we have opportunities to build these interactions in what we call advisory boards. So pharma will invite a number of experts from the academic world to discuss strategies for developing new drugs. I think that this is very important, And of course, there is a consulting fee given to the experts attending these advisory boards. These fees are ranging from about 800 to 2,500 euros, depending on how many hours of work are involved. And personally, I am totally in favor of full transparency in disclosing this kind of interaction, but at the end of the day, I think this interaction is in the best interest of patients most of the time. I now turn the microphone to Michel to finish this presentation.
Thank you, Professor Piccart. So the next slide. So I come back to the slides that you've seen already before with the question, is there a conflict of interest each time there is a payment? Next. And for that, Professor Piccart has proposed to an effort that we're trying to do several organizations together to put our own code of conduct in terms of conflict of interest, and she has proposed a grading of conflict of interest. So one could be very bad, one could be very much acceptable. The first one would be a financial compensation without any service provided to the industry. Of course, next, that is absolutely unacceptable. That could be compared to a tentative bribery to the person who would benefit from that financial exchange of value. Next. Second step would be to be on the board of directors of a pharma company, or owning shares, stock shares of the company, of having some financial gains from a patent. All that could generate, indeed, a conflict of interest, could generate for sure a payment of something, but being suspect to the bias of the person benefiting. The next. A financial compensation, as described by Professor Piccart, exceeding a certain amount to be defined for advisory function or for giving lectures to scientific congresses. Lectures being, if there is a financial compensation, of course, we could also there think that there could be a conflict of interest and that the person benefiting from it would be biased in favor of the company paying those fees. Next would be a financial compensation below the threshold that we would have defined there. Next. The work provided by Professor Piccart, for instance, would generate a grant that would go directly to the institution where she is employed to finance advancement in cancer, to finance research, additional research, for instance. And finally, last, well, no financial compensation at all of any kind. So that grading, as you see, we start from the worst and going to the least important. What to do, next slide, what to do in that type of situation when there is a conflict of interest? Well, when it is really bad, then you exclude the person benefiting from any public exposure and so on, and the person is banned, let's say, being so biased by the money receiving from the company. In less important or less difficult cases, well, it could be recused in certain, the person would be recused in certain activities and in certain type of intervention. But there's also a type of conflict of interest that could be resolved. That means could be absolutely modified, could be eliminated. And finally, for those that are fully acceptable, well, the disclosed is the solution. And that is what we are here together. That is to discuss about the disclosed, and that is the initiative taken at the beginning from EFPIA to disclose this. And as Professor Piccart said, those people that are honestly working and having acceptable conflict of interest have nothing against such disclosure. And this was my last slide.
Okay, thank you, Michel. Thank you, Professor Piccart. Could I pick up one thing about this the self-regulatory code. How does this fit into the EFPIA Code? Is this an internal ethics code of sorts? How does it connect with the EFPIA Code, which is coming in 2016?
May I answer to that?
Please, Michel. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. So that code is an initiative taken by several healthcare associations grouped under an alliance called the Biomedical Alliance. Oh, yeah. And we were invited at a certain moment by EFPIA to attend a committee where we were discussing CME, so continuous medical education, and behavior, ethical behavior. And together we came to the conclusion that such a code is not the responsibility of the pharmaceutical industry, but should be developed by the professionals themselves. And so at the Biomed Alliance, of which my organization, the European Cancer Organization, is a member of, we've been working in developing a draft of such a code. That code is at this stage now circulating among the members of the Alliance. We are 21 big healthcare professionals associations, and circulating among those members for comment and input. And once it will be in its final version, we'll go back to EFPIA and to look at it together, and EFPIA promised us to endorse that code once it will be ready. And indeed, I mean, it is important because continuous medical education in the medical field is the responsibility and one of the prime mission of all our type of associations. Therefore, we are organizing congresses, but also many other live and distant events to help the doctors to stay correctly informed of the advancements of science.
Okay, and if for the most serious offence, as you listed, the result would be exclusion from, for example, the European Cancer Organization or other medical bodies. Is that correct? Okay.
Well, at this stage, this grading suggested by Professor Piccart is only a proposal to be added to this code of conduct, and still needs to be discussed, of course, approved internally before going back to EFPIA. And of course, I cannot answer to that question yet because this is nothing written in stone yet, and there's no final decision. But we could think that one of the consequences would be indeed the one that you just described.
Okay, and so in all cases under the EFPIA Code in 2016, all transfers of value of whatever kind will be disclosed. That's the plan. Professor Piccart, you spoke about some of the value that academia adds to industry. Can I ask you, why do you think this is not well understood by the public, and who should communicate this to the public?
Well, in fact, you see, my worry is the following, is that if we do not accompany this disclosure policy, which I support, by explanations. So imagine a patient goes to this website and sees that Dr. X has received, I don't know, 10,000 euro from pharmaceutical company X. And there is no explanation attached to that. Well, you know, this patient could start thinking, well, what does that mean? My doctor is working for this company, so my doctor perhaps is prescribing me a treatment, not because it's the best treatment, but just because this company is giving some financial compensation to this doctor. So I am really worried that there could be a lot of wrong interpretation. In fact, what I forgot to tell you is that, of course, it's not a majority of physicians who are closely involved in interaction with pharma on developing new strategies for improving patient care. It's a relatively small number of physicians, and And so my worry is that indeed, if you do not explain the nature of the relationship, these doctors could be viewed as dishonest people. It's just the opposite. You know, I think that if you have no conflict of interest, it means that you are not working in research with pharmaceutical industry. And in my view, that could be viewed also as a sign that you are not among the doctors trying to move the field forward. So to have some kind of conflict of interest, I think, in fact, is healthy, is a good sign. But the worry would come to me as a physician if I would discover that a colleague of mine receives indeed lots of money, and what would be suspicious also perhaps is if it would be from a single company.
And do you think that more detail will in fact help the public understand that this transfer of value is for drug development and things like this, rather than prescribing patterns?
I think yes. I think it's absolutely essential. I think the danger is huge that this will be completely misunderstood. So the communication will be absolutely key.
This is my next question then. In terms of preparation, is there anything that can be done by doctors and by professional medical organizations to get that message out there in advance of the value that's added on the drug development side, rather than let confusion emerge about prescribing and so on?
I think, well, if I may...
Yeah. Go ahead, Michel.
I think that this is exactly where we are with this webinar. We have been, when I say we, it's us, several CEOs of organizations and several leadership people like Professor Piccart, have been talking to EFPIA, explaining that we have nothing against the disclosure indeed, but that the communication is so important, and to address correctly the reason why there is such a relationship, and as a consequence only why there is financial compensation. The project of the original project of EFPIA is just to put list of names and list of financial amounts somewhere on a website, and we have, through our discussion, we came to a conclusion that we need to do an effort, a common effort together, EFPIA and the pharmaceutical industry on one side, and the HCPs and the associations on the other side, to make an effort of communication together, to develop that communication together in order to address correctly the message to the lay public, and to what Professor Piccart has said, saying, I don't want the patient to lose the trust in his or her doctor. I would add to that, we don't want the press to isolate financial information from the context and bon, create some kind of scandal, which we know is a potential risk.
And can I ask, apart from preparing the public, how well prepared do you think ordinary doctors across Europe are for the changes that are now coming? Do they know about the code, for example, and are they ready for, perhaps ready to communicate with patients who have questions, or journalists who call them when these figures become public?
In my mind, the public doesn't know that yet. The public doesn't have, largely speaking, I don't think the public have a question about this. I think the problem is more, the need is more on the side of the pharmaceutical industry, because there's been bribery before, and maybe still in certain country, and so there has been reason to develop information from the press to show the scandal that it could be, and the industry knows that it is limited indeed, even if it happens, but it happens only in very limited manner, but the reputation is there. And so that reputation needs to be corrected, of course.
Okay. Professor Piccart, you made an interesting point about saying to be a true expert, in fact, you should be engaged with research in this way. Do you think that view is common amongst your colleagues, or are you an isolated voice on that topic?
Well, I must confess to you that I never asked this question to colleagues, but I presume that most colleagues would understand this. Now, provided that this is still reasonable, you see, and I have never encountered a situation where a pharmaceutical company was coming with a very high amount of money to compensate for some kind of service. I think this is pretty much standardized now. There are not large variations there. And so this kind of compensation is remaining in what I think are normal limits. And therefore, I don't think that the colleagues who are not involved in this type of activity would disapprove it. You know, and on top of that, this type of activity often happens on weekends. So it's just extra work that you are doing, in fact. And it's a lot of travel because a lot of these meetings today are happening in the United States, where most of the companies have transferred their headquarters.
Okay. Okay, we're getting a few questions, but some of them they're very good questions, but they're specific to the practicalities of implementing the EFPIA Code. So I think it might be a good time to bring Victoria from ABPI, if you have to do it. So I'll hand over then to Victoria Saunders, in charge of public trust. Is your full title?
I think my title is Reputation Manager.
Reputation Manager.
That's quite a big ask for one person for the whole of the UK pharmaceutical industry, but there you go. Yes, hello everybody. As Gary said, my name is Victoria. I work at the Association of the British Pharmaceutical Industry here in London. I've only been in my post for 4 months. And I don't come from the pharmaceutical industry at all. My background is actually in government service. I was working in a government ministry before I came here on a year's secondment. So it's very interesting coming from a completely different sector where actually transparency and having one's personal data published is something quite routine. My salary in my old job was published online for anybody to look at. So, you know, it's interesting to sort of compare and contrast. I'm responsible at the ABPI. One of my responsibilities is for leading work around the Disclosure Code. And I spend a lot of my time going out and talking to pharmaceutical companies to support them with their preparations for implementing the code. I'm also responsible for leading the development of the UK central database for disclosure. In the UK here we've decided that we want to pursue a central platform because that we felt that would be the best way to actually enhance the usability and searchability of the data and make it easiest for patients to see what's going on rather than having to search several hundred different company websites for data about individual clinicians. And I'm also do a lot of work with the healthcare professionals because clearly, you know, although this is an industry-led initiative, it is very, very important that we do this in collaboration with the medical profession. As others have already said, you know, that relationship is so important to delivering the best healthcare we can, and we need to protect and respect that as best we can. So what I thought I would talk about really, and it will pick up on various things that Michel and Martine have said already, is to do with the conversations that we're having here in the UK with the healthcare profession, because obviously the very good questions that Duane has sort of set, topics of discussion for this were really about that relationship and you know, how we're managing that from both sides. So in the UK a year ago, We did some research with healthcare professionals. We did a survey. We had over 1,000 individual healthcare professionals replying to that. And that was really the basis for the industry here in the UK deciding to go down the central platform route. We had really high support from the healthcare professionals that replied to that survey for disclosure. So 90% were in favour of individual disclosure and said that they were in favour of their own data being disclosed. And 80% were in favour of the idea of a central platform. I hope the reason for that was that they could see that it was the best way to put the information out there in the most really useful and truly transparent way. Since that research, we have followed that up with a round table earlier in this year with about 20 different organisations from the medical professions attended, and then following that up with a series of bilaterals. And we're talking to a lot of the professional bodies in the UK are going to be doing work, events, conferences, discussions with their members, the medical professions in the UK over the autumn to really kick off that discussion much more widely. I think sort of picking up on Gary's question earlier, that or Dwayne's question actually, I think here in the UK that there's a very good understanding amongst the medical leadership that this project is happening, and there's been that understanding for a long time because this has been announced for several years now. So at that kind of leadership level there's a very good understanding, but at the individual healthcare professional level far less so. And certainly the companies that I go out and talk to, clearly they're signing contracts with individuals now for next year. There's information in those contracts about the disclosure and sort of having to ask consent to do that, and definitely companies are reporting a very low awareness, zero awareness perhaps in many cases from the healthcare professionals that they're contracting with. That's a really big issue for us, and I think there is a gap at the moment between the companies needing to have those discussions with individuals and perhaps at the strategic level within the medical profession, the conversation is still at that level. It's not really filtered down, and there is this sort of gap in the middle, what companies need at a very grassroots level, and then there isn't that join up. What we've decided as an industry body to do later this year is actually to write out to as many healthcare professionals in the UK as we can, write a letter which is going to explain what the initiative is, how it will affect individuals, how it will work in practice, and how we see it affecting individuals. Up until now, we've done quite a lot of media. We've had media articles. We've had those discussions with the professional bodies, but we feel that the time is getting very close that we do need that individual outreach. So that's what we're planning to do. In terms of discussions, the kind of issues that are coming up when we're talking to medical bodies in the UK, a range of things that Martine and Michel have touched on there. I think, first of all, we're definitely hearing from the medical professionals that we talk to that there is definitely at the moment perhaps not a very well articulated narrative around why we have these relationships and what the benefits are. It was really great to see some of Martine's kind of case studies there, tangible examples of where the collaboration has really added to what we know about medicine and patient care. I would say though that some of Martine's examples there are clearly about research and development, and of course those payments won't be disclosed individually under the code. That gap and other gaps, which I'll talk about a little bit later perhaps, are definitely a kind of issue there that are still unresolved with, disclosing some payments for some relationships, but not all, and that may well be a circle that we need to square later
If
on.
I can just jump into this, is Dwayne. One of the things that Martine, I think, was pointing out, though, is that's the education around the research. And that, I think, has been the core area where the industry and practitioner partnership has traditionally succeeded. I mean, obviously we want to, that still is a main part of the support structure. Is that correct? I mean, the educational side around new technologies, new applications of
yeah, medical education is within the individual disclosure.
Sure.
But activities around research and development aren't. And I know from a company point of view that you know, a lot of companies are thinking quite carefully about where are the boundaries for those categories and trying to get that right. Because clearly none of us want to, you know, ideally we want to disclose as much individually as we can. And so getting that separation is really crucial. Our UK code and the EFPIA Code are quite specific about what falls into R&D and what doesn't, so it's fine. So I think in the UK, I think my feeling as someone who's coming new to this is that the industry has quite a good narrative at the moment. You know, we have been talking for quite a long time as an industry about these kind of collaborative relationships and the reasons why there's a financial transactions involved, you know, and the fact that we have quite a very strict code of self-regulation, that there are upper limits for payments, and you know, many of the things that were associated years ago, you know, with bad press with pharmaceutical industry just don't happen anymore. You know, expensive holidays abroad and lavish hospitality is just a thing of the past, and that's something that we as an industry have talked a lot about and been proud of. I think when I'm going out and talking to medical professionals, though, perhaps for the medical professionals, the medical professions, that narrative, those rationales aren't really as strongly as articulated perhaps as they will need to be. And I know that many of the medical bodies in the UK are starting to talk about that, about strengthening that story, the narrative rationale, and you know, assembling some case studies and some really tangible examples of what people do and why it's beneficial. Martine mentioned that the global nature of the pharmaceutical industry, I think that is something that's not well understood, and that's definitely coming up in conversation. Why do people have to go abroad? And I think that the global nature of the industry is something that many people on the street wouldn't realise, and having, you know, some good examples of why international travel needs to happen will be something that we're looking at, we're talking to our members about. I know that, I mean, all the medical professions in the UK have really strong codes of conduct, which cover things like conflicts of interest. I know the medical professionals are saying to us that they are discussing, they're going to be looking at, you know, whether those need strengthening, whether they need to be just used more and observed more. The British Medical Journal published an article in July about the EFPIA disclosure requirements, and the discussion that followed that on their website, you know, there were plenty of physicians there who were saying, you know, we have these codes of conduct already, we just probably need to use them more. And as Martine was saying, and Michel, think about you know, maybe the levels, what is reasonable and what isn't. And at the moment, I think, you know, the medical professions as a whole haven't needed to make those kind of value judgments themselves, or the publication of data may ask questions about that they will need to have answers to. So I think conflicts of interest, just an observation there that I thought was interesting. In the UK, yes, there's a conflict of interest around, you know, suspicions of undue influence on decision making, but also we see in discussions that there are possibly in the UK potential conflicts around perhaps the kind of the National Health Service aspect of it. So, you know, it is an HCP's involvement with a commercial company taking them away from their public sector practice? Is it restricting their availability to see patients in a public sector setting? We can see that as being questions that might well be asked. And also perhaps, I mean, Martine said a lot of this work is done at the weekend, but I mean, I guess weekends are there for people to rest and recuperate. And again, I can see that there may be some concerns from patients about the amount of work that someone might be doing, you know, outside of their NHS practice, and whether that is having an effect on their health, their well-being, their ability to concentrate. So I think, you know, queries could come from all sorts of different directions, and just having that really sound rationale, some really good examples. And Gary said about preparing individuals. I do think that the professions will need to think about how they can support individual GPs. In the UK, there is not really any culture. It's not, you know, people don't have much of a choice about their doctor. Generally, they tend to register with the doctor that's closest to them, you know, people don't look at reviews generally, typically about their doctor or even their hospital. Not like in the US, where there's much more of that sort of customer expectation. So these kinds of questions might be very new for physicians in the UK, I think, and they will need some support with that, which we are offering to the medical profession. But I think it's very much them that need to sort of think about how they deliver that and what people need. So that just gives you a flavour of what's happening in the UK.
Okay, thank you, Victoria. I know in the Netherlands they have, they're a little bit further ahead. The UK obviously is ahead of most of other EU countries, I think, but the Netherlands has done this and it hasn't had a major impact on the behaviour of doctors in terms of cooperating. But are you hearing, in terms of feedback from member companies, are you hearing any changes in whether doctors are willing to participate in advisory boards or attend conferences with sponsorship?
Yeah. When we did the survey with HCPs that I referred to last year, 70% of them said that they didn't feel that this would have an impact. 14% said that they did think that they would probably work less with industry, but 8% actually said they thought it might encourage them to have more contact because that transparency and openness was a reassurance to them. So I think, you know, it's very much to be seen. At the moment, I think the feeling, definitely I'm not getting a lot of feedback to say that there's very adverse reaction, but I am getting feedback from companies to say that people haven't heard about it, it's new, you know, they're taking it well, but actually whether once we're further down the line, people have had more time to think about it, whether once people have seen the amounts that will be disclosed and we get to that actual publication date, whether people will change their minds or not, I don't know. And I think that's why it's really important that we all try to support a debate and for the medical professions to be able to talk about that between themselves, because I think that's one way that people perhaps will be reassured, you know, once they understand whether their peers are taking part, you know, those kind of things. Yeah.
How will we know whether it's working? I mean, at the moment, I mentioned 2016 earlier, but in fact, that's 2015 data.
Yeah.
So as you said,
yeah,
people who are attending a conference in February, or an ad board next spring, those decisions are being made now and contracts are being signed. How will we know whether or not the trend is just to comply and publish everything?
Well, I mean, I think obviously individual companies will be getting feedback about what's happening, you know, the reaction that they're having to contract, but certainly, you know, in terms of consent, under the data protection provisions, a healthcare professional can withdraw that consent at any time. The fact that they've given it at the outset doesn't mean to say they can't change their minds, and I think it would be really interesting to, you know, so I suppose what I'm saying is at the beginning we might see people consenting, but there's nothing to say that they won't withdraw that at a later stage. So really, you know, the acid test is going to be the publication date.
Okay.
Even after that, because once we've published it, people could still withdraw their consent. So I think we're just going to have to try it and see.
Okay. As you say, the survey you did suggest there's a general openness to transparency, openness to openness. Let me ask, I'm going to go to some of these questions. Let me quickly bring Michel back in, though, on that question. Do you think that physicians will change how they behave and how they interact with industry when they find out a little more about the EFPIA Code?
Well, if I can say, unfortunately, I'm not surprised of the result of the survey that Victoria has just explained. 70%, if I understand well, 70% of the person who answered thought there will be an impact, and I presume what they mean it's a negative impact. Unfortunately, as I said, I'm not surprised, because that's the proof of that we are right when we say we need to address the communication correctly. If they're afraid.
Michel, I think we need to clarify that. It wasn't 70% approve of disclosure?
Yeah, sorry, Michel. So 70% of the HCPs we surveyed said that they thought that individual disclosure would have no impact on their relationships with pharmaceutical companies. 14%, 14, said they thought that they would be likely to do less work with pharmaceutical industry, so a negative impact, 14, and 8% thought that it would actually have a positive impact, that they would be more reassured to work with industry if those payments were disclosed individually. So the majority, 70, felt there would be no impact.
Okay. I got it wrong then, I'm sorry.
There is no right or wrong, Michel.
Here now, I think we have quite a few questions coming in. Let's go through them. The first one I see at the top is from Nicola McElroy. It is, so I'll just read the questions. I think microphones is probably complicating things. So the question is, will there be an EU-wide reconciliation between the transfer of value disclosure by the pharma companies and what the HCP disclosed personally?
Reconciling, so this is a question reconciling transfers by the companies and HCPs. Is that reconciled, and how is that process managed? I suppose that's a question for Victoria.
Oh, well.
Go, Victoria.
Yeah, well, I mean, I think Nicola's right to spot this, and definitely, you know, in our UK discussions, there's definitely a gap here. What we as an industry disclose, you know, this is only pharmaceutical, and individual for an individual healthcare professional, that might only represent a portion of the money that they might be accepting from different sectors, you know, devices, diagnostics, and all the other sorts of commercial relationships. So, you know, there is a discussion in the UK, definitely in the social media space, where doctors are talking about, you know, is there room for a medical disclosure website? Should we come in with the pharmaceutical one? And definitely in terms of how we're developing our central platform, you know, we are developing it with an eye to the future, and we would very much welcome other sectors coming on board. So I mean, I think the answer is there's not an answer at the moment, but it's definitely a possibility for the future, and something that we will have to sort out.
Okay, well, here's another one that you've partially answered already, in fact, from Jennifer Peters, is how do pharma companies collect consent from HCPs for disclosure? Should it be every time an expense is encountered, or is it an annual thing?
Okay, well, that's quite a technical question. I guess it will depend from country to country as well. I mean, clearly countries where their central platform is mandated by legislation, it's a different matter. In the UK, we're doing this as a voluntary self-regulatory thing, and so we have to do it within the data protection rules here. Data protection requirements say that consent has to be given freely and consent has to be informed. And so our advice as a trade body to companies is that, you know, that consent needs to be in contracts. If they're contracting with an HCP for a particular piece of work, then the consent will be there. If the contract is for a longer period, then that consent will be for a longer period. But as I said, you know, the law protects individuals and they can change their consent, opt in or opt out at any time.
Okay, I think I'll come back to some of the early ones, but there's one there saying, what would be the amount considered as acceptable for financial compensation following a lecture? Maybe that's one for Professor Piccart. It's a broad question, but what amount is considered acceptable for payment for a lecture?
For a lecture, you know, it will depend a little bit on the amount of work that you need to put together, because if you have to make an extensive review on a topic and you need to work 2-3 days at home to produce the talk, then I think it's normal that the compensation for that type of talk is a little higher than if you just present the results of a study, you know, something that you can prepare in less than 2-3 hours. But the fees for this type of lectures, as far as I have seen, is pretty standardized across companies, and so it's never a huge amount of money.
Okay, thank you. Worth noting that some countries have a threshold above which disclosure is made, and if you don't earn a fee above that threshold, it's not publicized. In the UK, everything will be disclosed, but in the Netherlands, if you earn less than €500, a nominal fee for presenting something perhaps, it would not necessarily appear in the list. Let's have a look at a few more of these. A question, is there a public communication campaign planned at the European or country level to avoid misinterpretation? Well, I mean, yes, Victoria has already explained that there's a quite extensive communication happening. In terms of the European level, they're trying to avoid difficulties. Maybe I'll go back to Michel for this. For pan-European organizations like your own, Michel, is this something that can be done given the differences between member states in the European Union?
Well, we can use our traditional communication systems like of course our website and like our social media activities, but conducting a real campaign, which I think is absolutely needed, but conducting such a campaign requires financial investments that we cannot afford. So again, I think that's something that we need first to prepare and to build together both sides, the industry and HCPs, HCOs, in order to make sure that we have a proper message there. But the financial of it needs to happen, and unfortunately, I think from the pharmaceutical side, because they have the means. We don't really.
Okay. Dwayne, I'll bring you in.
Sure. Obviously, from my standpoint, what we're trying to do, Pharmadisclosure.eu is a pan-European portal. We have a steering committee. Michel is a member of the steering committee. We are currently in the process with Michel and several other stakeholders developing a pan-European approach to discuss the collaboration between industry and researchers. And so I think we've started this, it's been very successful, but going forward there is an appetite from the HCPs, from the HCOs, from industry to see Pharmadisclosure become that sort of cipher for all of the national associations to sort of park their activities. And we will be doing more work going forward. In fact, we're finalizing some activities in Hungary around the launch of their portal, and we may even be doing, if we're getting very ambitious, we may even do some work in local language. So we really see Pharmadisclosure as becoming this sort of repository of all the knowledge from, basically what will happen is in the member state level and at the EFPIA level it will be members dealing with very technical questions, but then the overall communication from a pan-European level will start parking at Pharmadisclosure. And it's a very good question. Thank you.
Let me have a look at the next one. We scroll down, there's quite a long list of questions to go through.
And getting longer.
Getting longer, yeah. Can sales representatives be leveraged to conduct such communication Well, Victoria, do you have a view on this? It's a tricky one.
Yeah, well, I mean, certainly there are companies in the UK who are who will, you know, definitely be providing training to their field forces, and we've been discussing as a trade association whether we should centrally develop some materials for use with sales force training. I think it does depend, though, very much on the company model as to, you know, who it is within the company that's actually contracting with HCPs or recruiting, you know, sort of arranging these sorts of things with HCPs. I think, you know, sometimes it would be appropriate if it would normally be a sales rep who would arrange local training, for example, then absolutely they're going to need to know about this, they're going to have to understand about consent to disclose and privacy and how we're going to be disclosing on a central platform. But for other HCP relationships, it wouldn't be appropriate at all. So I think, you know, it has to be done on a sort of case-by-case basis, depending on who is doing what within the company and with HCPs.
Okay, great. Keep cracking on through this list. So what is the opinion of the panel with respect to the number of HCPs who are likely to agree to have their details disclosed? And do you think this will have to become law before transparency is achieved, like in France? Is the question. Victoria, you already, to an extent, answered the how many HCPs will likely agree to have their details disclosed. In terms of becoming law, do you have a view on this? I mean, the purpose, I suppose, is to have a code that's voluntary and well established. But what do you think of the legal option?
Well, I guess again this comes back to different countries and different governments. I think here in the UK, our code of practice is you know, long established, well respected, and I think as long as it remains so, then you know, we haven't seen any move from present government to want to do anything. But I think they see that we are, you know, taking very proactive measures as an industry. But you know, as I said, once the data is published, people may take a different view, as you know, has happened in other countries where clearly there have been things that have happened, media stories, political questions, etc., which have prompted the government to take that legislative step. I mean, I very much hope that we don't need to go down that way. I think that transparency is definitely in the, you know, to benefit of everybody. That you know, to have to force the medical profession to provide you know, to agree to this would seem to be a disproportionate and unnecessary step. I'm sure that we can get there, but as Michel observed earlier, it's all about discussion and building that understanding and a kind of joint feeling of common purpose. And we're not quite there yet, but many of us are working very hard to do that.
Okay, can I ask the same question? Okay, Michel, the same question to you. Go ahead.
Yeah, but I wanted to add something there. I think that it's clear at the level of industry, and it's clear on our side also, that we would like to avoid that there are laws coming in, and that the self-regulation will be satisfactory enough and addressing the issue well enough to avoid it. Because we don't want to be in the same situation that what happened in the United States, where there is the law, it's called the Sunshine Act, and which goes to extreme because it has been built by, probably, I presume, by non-expert people and non-involved people, so not understanding the relationship and what's happening there correctly. And for those who don't know the Sunshine Act, it went at a certain moment that much into the details that even a cup of coffee offered to a doctor had to be declared, and to be transparent on that far is of course very extreme.
Yeah, okay. You can imagine at some of those medical conferences where there's coffee at a stand trying to take names and addresses for disclosure purposes. I'd asked earlier on about whether the behaviour of HCPs might change, but there's a question in to ask if a HCP refuses to disclose or to have their details disclosed, will it change the behaviour of companies towards that doctor? For example, would they stop inviting them to events if they won't collaborate with the transparency rules? Victoria, have you come across this one yet? I suppose not yet, but what do you anticipate will happen?
Well, in the UK, as I said before, I mean, actually, it's not just the UK, it's an EU directive on data protection. It's very clear that consent has to be given freely and in an informed way, and our understanding is that this definition of freely, you know, it has to be just that. They can't get into a position where someone's told either you consent or you don't get the work, because that wouldn't be free consent. Yeah. And you know, we're providing the options for companies to disclose in aggregate. So any HCP who doesn't consent, then a company will still be disclosing that payment took place. It will just be done anonymously. So we'll be disclosing the total amount that was paid to people who didn't give their consent and how many HCPs that covered. And we're already doing that in the UK. So for the past 2 years, we have had that aggregate disclosure where we publish the total amount and the number of HCPs that covers. It was £38.5 million last year, probably covering around 20,000 HCP payments, but many of those were the same HCP. Okay. So we're not quite sure what the total number of HCPs are, but there were, you know, 20,000 records from companies made, but some of those will be for the same HCP. So, you know, I'm not. That's what the situation is. It's legally around data protection, and companies will be compliant with the code. You know, whether they work with someone who consents or who doesn't. I mean, I think it will be interesting. It was interesting to hear sort of what Martine was talking about in terms of the medical professions themselves and what attitude they will take. You know, I think we're waiting to see here in the UK whether any of the medical bodies will come out with a clear position about, well, whether they recommend their members to consent or not. So.
Can I ask that question to you, Martine? Do you think professional medical organisations will bluntly encourage members to disclose?
I think so, yes.
Okay.
It already happened in several professional organizations where I am a member that, you know, everybody thinks that there is need for this kind of transparency. Now, at the same time, I think it would be great if we could agree on some type of scale, because currently what we can see in many congresses, you know, well, you have a speaker coming on stage and then you see this disclosure slide, but it does not give you any idea about the extent of the possible conflict. And that's why I think if we could agree on a scale, it would be a kind of common language that could be used across different scenarios, different specialties. It would be nice, but it's not going to be easy to agree on a scale.
Okay.
I'm afraid.
Okay, thank you. We have several questions asking in different ways for information about the survey that Victoria mentioned. Victoria, you said it was actually published in the BMJ.
Yeah, that's right. It was published in the British Medical Journal, and it was published on the 9th of October last year.
And there's a question, will there be any penalties for non-EFPIA member companies if they do not publicly disclose information? Well, I mean, I don't know who would penalize them if they're not a member. They haven't.
Yeah, it's not just to clarify. I mean, the code is a self-governing code right now by the industry, and this is the European pharmaceutical industry. We've also had several questions here coming in about contract research organizations, CROs. The CROs would legally be operating on behalf of the pharmaceutical company in the prescription environment, delivering the pharmaceutical company's their drugs. So again, I believe it's still under the responsibility of the official organization who's doing the drug development, not necessarily the CRO. They're a subcontractor. I know there are some discussions right now with some generics organizations internationally. As of right now, this is an EFPIA Code and the EFPIA member associations, and that's how it's being administered. So again, very good questions. Obviously, there's even in EFPIA, there's some work to do on how we communicate this, I gather. So we'll keep cracking up.
As you say, Glenn, it's a European industry code. Maybe, Michel, could I ask you, because you have one eye on Europe in the broad sense, do you notice any differences between how this is being received in different corners of Europe? Is there a difference, for example, between, France and the UK compared to Poland, Hungary, and other countries further to the centre and east of Europe?
Well, I think not in terms of developing the code. The code will be European-wide and applicable, to answer to the previous question, applicable to the members of EFPIA. So if a company is not a member of EFPIA, I presume, since it is self-regulation, that there is no obligation and no sanction. But in terms of the revenue generated by such a relationship, it is indeed noticeable that there is a difference in between a Western European and an Eastern European, because if, as Professor Piccart said, it is more or less standardized among the different companies, wherever you live has a different impact, of course. The same amount, you mentioned, Martine, like in between 800 and 2,000 euros or 2,500 euros. Well, in a salary of a Western European high-level doctors, that probably is interesting, but not necessarily impacting a lot your life. When you're in the former communist countries in the eastern part of the continent, where salaries are way lower, of course the same amount has a significant impact on your personal and private life. Yeah. And it is the case, I'm afraid, for countries indeed like Hungary or those eastern countries, where we all know that the standard of living is not the same in those countries than in the Western ones. Yeah.
Okay, thank you, Michel. Okay, let's have a look at a few more. Does EFPIA plan to develop a single platform to host the reports? Are you aware, Victoria, whether there's going to be an EFPIA? I haven't heard. It mostly seems to be done at a national level.
Yeah.
EFPIA Code with national implementation.
I think the general feeling was that this is going to be implemented at the member state level or through the associations, just because there's such divergent regulations on a state-by-state level still. While healthcare is regulated for new medicines through the EMA and DG SENCO, the fact is healthcare decisions are still a member state choice. So there are so many wide, divergent, diffuse regulatory regimes in each of the countries. It would be very difficult to try to centralize this, which is why it's a state-by-state, member state implementation.
Okay, maybe we'll scroll down and see a few more of these questions. There is some duplication in the questions we're taking, but let's have a look. Penalties, I think we had that one.
Yes, that's right.
Okay. There was one.
No, this is this is a pretty.
Do companies need to disclose the amounts given to HCP blindly if HCP does not give consent? Yes, the answer to that, Victoria. The amounts will be disclosed in aggregate, even if the names are not published.
Yes.
And will it be known when a doctor opts out of having their data published?
No.
No. Okay.
No. So under the code, well, companies can only publish data about the payments they have made. They can't publish data about the payments they didn't make, or the HCPs they didn't have dealings with. I think one of the things in our conversations with the medical professionals in the UK, definitely one of the things that's come up from them though, is an appetite for doctors to be able, or HCPs to be able to proactively make their own declarations, and that might include a positive, negative declaration. So someone who can positively say, I have not taken any payments that of the code. So, you know, I think there might be some appetite for that, and as I said earlier, you know, I'm aware from social media that clearly members of professional bodies in the UK are discussing, you know, this whole issue themselves, and you know, whether there is an option for them proactively to do more in terms of declarations.
Okay. So that's just on a question that we had about the incentive for a doctor to consent. The question says, what's the incentive for a HCP to consent? Moreover, what is the incentive for pharma to insist on consent? Surely we're making work for ourselves. Does that require an answer?
Michel, do you think it's an incentive for, what's the incentive for you to consent?
That's a tricky question.
I didn't invent it.
I think everything would be simpler if I think everything would be simpler if there was no need to have such a disclosure, of course. An incentive, I think the incentive is that if it happens with some people, you will be more remarked if you don't accept than if you do accept, I presume. If you don't consent, that creates, I presume, that would create some suspicion. Why not? Yeah.
There'll be peer pressure to some extent amongst doctors, and even patients wondering why their doctor not at all collaborating.
Could be, yeah, could be.
But as well, Michel, Mrs. Duane again, I think what we've seen in all the data is that overwhelmingly people think disclosure is better than non-disclosure. I think there's a general feeling that it improves trust.
Yeah, I really think indeed that the principle itself is not that difficult to accept, and it's logical. Transparency nowadays became, in all fields, in all areas, it becomes a standard. Again and again, and I'm sorry to repeat myself, it's the way it is communicated that is important.
Yeah, indeed, it is indeed the trend, and probably more damaging to not be transparent than to be transparent.
It'd be interesting to get Professor Piccard's opinion. I mean, if she, you know, about Professor Piccart, do you think ultimately this will improve the level of trust between your, as a practitioner, and your patients? Ultimately, I mean, it may take a while, but ultimately, will it be beneficial long term?
I hope so. You know, there is absolutely nothing to hide here. I just explained. I think these relationships are vital for making progress. You know, if you work in a pharmaceutical company completely disconnected from patients, the reality of patients, you are going to get ideas about developing innovative drugs that could be very, very far away from what is really needed. So this interaction is absolutely key, and I don't think we should hide anything. It should be open, again, provided that the public understands why this relationship exists.
Okay, thank you. There was a question about whether or not consent to disclose. It's just scroll down a little. If a doctor consents to have their information disclosed, does it apply to that contract, or is it for everything forevermore? I think perhaps, Victoria, you've already said that the doctor could even come back and withdraw consent later if afterwards they decide to have a change of heart. So I think that's already been.
Of course, that's the right of privacy. It happens even with Google now, that people can retract information from whatever is on the net. Yeah.
Okay, so we're coming quite close to our time. Maybe there were some topics we had at the very beginning of the discussion, and maybe I'll just go to the last of those questions which Duane had set in terms of where we go from here. And the question was, what tangible steps can the industry and practitioners take to improve public trust after the launch of the code? And maybe I'll begin with you, Michel, if you don't mind. What steps can the industry and practitioners take to improve public trust?
well, I'm afraid I'm afraid that I repeat all the time the same thing, but it's a matter of communication. So I think that we on our websites, we need to be clear. We need to explain indeed what we need to report, what we do, and what our leadership and our members are doing. And I think that on the side of the pharmaceutical industry, they have to explain all that content, all that value, that scientific value they receive from that relationship. And I would say, to make it very simple, the pharmaceutical industry, they're on the side of the laboratories and the research, and the doctors, they're on the side. It's a little bit too cartoonish what I'm saying here, but the doctors, they're on the side of the patient, and they can bring that information from the patients and what they observe with the patient and all the knowledge they have about it.
Okay.
So that is the quality of that relationship.
Perfect. Thank you so much. Professor Piccart, would you have a final thought on what happens next?
Well, my strong hope is that we can come to a kind of consensus among different medical disciplines through the Biomedical Alliance, for example, because I think if we can already be united, all of us, that will greatly facilitate the interaction with industry and will facilitate the production of very good communication towards the lay public.
Okay, thank you very much. And then finally, Victoria, any last thoughts on where we go from here?
I think that the question was specifically around improving public trust, and it's a really good opportunity for all of us to explain how we work together and the benefits that that brings. I think that isn't something that is well understood. The whole development management process is something that the public, could usefully know more about. So that's a real opportunity. Yeah, and I guess the other thing which I haven't got an answer for is just how we bring other sectors in. The individual disclosure is only a part of the picture now, that there are so many other areas that could usefully be part of the initiative, and that will be interesting to see how that develops.
Okay, thank you very much. Okay, well, with that, I thank you all very much for your participation and for your questions. I hope I got through as many as possible. Apologies to those whose questions I couldn't quite get to. It was only because of the volume, which is a good sign of interest in this area. There will be a report on this circulated to all of you who have registered that will come your way by the end of the week, and the transcript will be available. But for the moment, thank you very much for participating in this chapter of the conversation, which will certainly continue in the months and years ahead. And stay tuned to Pharmadisclosure.eu for the latest updates on this. Thank you very much.